The Sedition Act of 1798 was one of the four laws that was written by John Adams' administration that was passed and made into law by the Fifth Congress of the United States on July 14, 1798. The act was made into law by a close vote of 44 to 41 in Congress and was signed by President Adams. There was a sunset clause written in the act which would make it null and void on March 5, 1801. The formal title of the Sedition Act is an addition to the act entitled An Act for the Punishment of Certain Crimes Against the United States. The law made it illegal to print false, scandalous, and malicious writings or writing against the government of the United States or either House of Congress of the United States or the President of the United States. The Sedition Act was used by the Adams administration to go after perceived enemies of the Federalist Party, supporters of the Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson, and foes of President Adams. The first person to be charged with violating the Sedition Act was the grandson of Benjamin Franklin, the editor of the Philadelphia Aurora, Benjamin Franklin Bach. He was a vocal critic of President Adams, his administration, and the Federalist Party. Bach wrote in the Philadelphia Aurora that President Adams was blind, bald, crippled, toothless, and querulous. He also accused the president of having monarchical ambitions and was a recipient of nepotism. The editor was a pro-Democrat and supporter of France, which made him a target. His stance in the XYZ affair, when he wrote editorials which were in favor of France and critical of the Adams administration, was the final straw. Bach was arrested for libel, but was released on parole. Unfortunately, he died from yellow fever on September 8, 1798, at the age of 29, right before his case was scheduled to go to trial. The first person to be convicted under the Sedition Act was Democratic Republican Congressman Matthew Lyon from the state of Vermont. Lyon was a huge critic of President Adams and created his own newspaper to publish his editorials after the Rutland Daily Herald refused to print them. Lyon's paper, the scourge of aristocracy and repository of important political truth, printed the editorials. The October 1st issue published a scathing attack on President Adams, accusing him of having an unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and self-avarice. He also said the president was using religion to wanting to wage war against France and called him a bully. Lyon was arrested for violating the Sedition Act. He was also charged with publishing letters from poet Joel Barlow, who he also read during his political stumps. At his trial, after being accused of violating the Sedition Act, Congressman Lyon, in his defense, said the law was unconstitutional and a violation of his First Amendment. The judge at his trial, Edward Mooney, found him guilty on October 10, 1798, and sentenced Congressman Lyon to 4 months in jail and a $1,000 fine. The judge told Lyon he wished he could have given him a longer sentence. Lyon was re-elected to Congress a month later, becoming the first congressman to be elected while sitting in jail. He was eventually released, and he told the crowd of supporters who waited for him outside the Virgin's facility that, "I'm on my way to Philadelphia." Vermont printer Anthony Haswell was arrested for violating the Sedition Act when he republished editorials that were written by Benjamin Bach and Congressman Matthew Lyon. Haswell was a supporter of the Democratic Republicans and a vocal critic of President Adams. He printed an ad for a lottery, which the proceeds would be used to help pay the $1,000 fine that Matthew Lyon was fined. When word got out that Haswell was printing the editorials, Federalist Sheriff Jazbez Fitch arrested him in the middle of the night and jailed him 50 miles away from his home in the town of Rutland. He went to trial and was convicted of libel on May 5, 1800, along with a 2-month jail sentence and a $200 fine. The third target of the Federalist Party was newspaper publisher and journalist William Duane. He was a co-worker of Benjamin Franklin Bach at the Philadelphia Aurora, and he was a supporter of the United Irishmen, along with being a member of the Democratic Republicans. When Bach died during the outbreak of yellow fever in the summer of 1798, Duane lost his wife as well, but later married the widow of Bach. The two continued the work of Benjamin Franklin Bach and attacked the Adams administration in the press. Duane was charged with libel under the Sedition Act. The first time was in February of 1799 for allegedly trying to start a pro-United Irishman riot. The second was for printing articles and editorials suggesting that Great Britain was trying to influence the United States government under the Adams administration a month later. Grand juries in both cases refused to prosecute. The government wasn't finished with him, however, and in the month of May, Duane was severely beaten by federal army officers when he refused to give up his sources on an article he published about the brutal suppression of the Friars Rebellion. Dave Brown, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, was arrested under the Sedition Act for traveling around New England putting up a liberty pole that had a banner that read, "No Stamp Act, no Sedition Act, no alien bills, no land tax, downfall to the tyrants of America, peace and retirement to the president, long live the vice president," and for giving anti-Adams and Federalist speeches. Despite doing this for the past 2 years, the government waited to prosecute him until the Sedition Act was passed. Brown felt the wealthy had gained too much power in the government and said, "All our administration is fast approaching to the lords and commons as possible, and that a few men should possess the whole country and the rest be tenants to the others." Brown was arrested in Andover, Massachusetts, but he couldn't afford a $4,000 bail, so he was sent to Salem and tried there. He was charged on June of 1799 and pled innocent until he realized how strong the case was against him. The Federalists felt that there were other rabble-rousers like him and wanted to make Brown an example. Federalist congressman from Massachusetts, Fisher Ames, called Brown a wandering apostle of sedition, who told bold falsehoods and artful and inflammatory sophistry. He was one of the people involved in Brown's arrest. His trial was presided over by Judge Samuel Chase, and despite Brown changing his original plea from innocent to guilty, wanted him to name all the people involved with his liberty pole, his followers, and those who subscribed to his newsletter. David Brown refused to drop names because he would lose all of his friends. Judge Chase called up several witnesses for the prosecution, who all agreed that Brown's speeches and newsletter had a large effect on them and in those who heard them. Brown couldn't afford a lawyer and was unable to cross-examine them, despite pleading for mercy, telling the judge that he wouldn't do this again, and begging him not to fine him because he had no money. But Judge Chase fined him over $400 and sentenced him to 8 months in prison. On December of 1800, Brown was still in prison, and he tried to get President Adams to give him a pardon and waive the fine, but he declined the request. When Thomas Jefferson came into office a few months later, he gave Brown and all those charged under the Sedition Act a full pardon. James Callender was a Scottish immigrant to the United States. After arriving in Philadelphia, he was a vocal critic of the Adams administration and supporter of the Democratic Republicans. He also wrote and published pamphlets, which were supported by Thomas Jefferson, who became his benefactor and even proofread some of his anti-Federalist pamphlets. Jefferson wanted to have some anti-Federalist publishers on his side to counteract the flood of Federalist-friendly publishers. Callender fled Philadelphia in early 1800 due to his articles attacking Alexander Hamilton and exposing his extramarital affair. He settled in Richmond, Virginia, and resumed his articles attacking the Federalist Party and President Adams. Callender was arrested for violating the Sedition Act, and his trial was presided over by Judge Samuel Chase. He was found guilty of libel and was fined $200, along with several months in prison. He was released on President Adams' final day in office on March 4, 1801. The final person to be arrested and tried for violating the Sedition Act was Luther Baldwin. He was a drunk bar patron hanging out with his friends while President Adams' motorcade went through the city of Newark, New Jersey in June of 1798. The president was passing through on his way to New England. Several cannons were fired in the air to salute the president. When one of his buddies leaned over and said, "There goes the president, and they're firing at his ass," Luther replied, "I don't care if they fired through his ass." A bar patron who happened to be a staunch Federalist yelled at him and said, "That's sedition." Luther was arrested and stood in front of the Newark authorities and was found guilty of violating the Sedition Act and was ordered to pay a $100 fine. The Sedition Act ended when Thomas Jefferson was sworn in as the third president of the United States, and one of the first things he did was pardon all those who were convicted of violating said act. Justice Samuel Chase, who was more than happy to enforce the Sedition Act, was impeached by Congress on March 12, 1804 for high crimes and misdemeanors. Most of the charges that were brought up against him pertained to the Sedition Act and the trials of James Callender and grand jury misconduct during said trial. Chase was acquitted of the charges despite 73 out of the 105 congressmen finding him guilty on all accounts. Unfortunately, today, our current president of the United States is trying to bring back the Sedition Act. And if he does, God save us all.